Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Gates Cambridge panel discussion at the Cambridge Alumni Festival on how can we secure a lasting peace after conflict. So my name is Sharath Srinivasan, and at Cambridge I co-direct the Centre of Governance and Human Rights, and I'm also the David and Elaine Potter Lecturer in Governance and Human Rights in the Department of Politics and International Studies and a Fellow at King's College. This year marks the 20th anniversary of Gates Cambridge. The scholarship program for international postgraduates was set up in 2000 after a $210 million grant to the University of Cambridge from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Scholars are selected based on their academic excellence, but also on their strong commitment to improving the lives of others. And on this panel today, we are privileged to hear from three such inspiring Gates Cambridge scholars: Dr. Njoki Wamai, Dr. Mateja Peter, and Ms. Harum Mukhayer. So I will introduce each of them in turn as they share their research on different aspects of peace building in Africa and beyond, from justice after political violence and international responses to civil conflict, to border disputes and the role of international law. My own work has looked at the international interventions in civil wars in Africa, focused especially on Sudan and South Sudan, where I've researched for a number of decades. And I particularly looked at peacemaking and its role. And one of the striking things for me about Sudan is that recently, in the context of major political change, the Sudanese have been leading work on securing a conflict to end the long-standing, a peace agreement to end the long-standing Darfur conflict and conflict in central Sudan, and also involved in a civilian uprising in the deposing of President Omar al-Bashir in 2019. And in this context, international interventions were sort of in the back seat. They receded from view. And this poses some really interesting questions about whether this was mere coincidence or what role does international intervention towards building lasting peace have? How can we interrogate the role of international actors in these kinds of processes? So we need to find out more, and we will this evening. Each of our speakers will deliver a short presentation followed by a Q&A session, and you will have the ability to ask them questions. Now I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, and that's Dr. Njoki Wamai. Njoki Wamai is a Kenyan assistant professor of international relations at the United States International University in Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. And previously, she was a postdoctoral research associate at the Centre of Governance and Human Rights in Cambridge. She started her PhD at the University of Cambridge in 2012 as a Gates Cambridge scholar, where she pursued a PhD in politics and international studies. And recently she returned to Kenya after 6 years. While a Gates scholar, she was awarded the Bill Gates Senior Prize for outstanding scholars who embody the leadership, academic excellence, and social justice goals of the scholarship program. Njoki is a feminist and a scholar activist, and I can say that through and through. While in Cambridge, Njoki co-founded the Black Cantabs Research Society, which is a historical and political project that archives and curates Black people who have studied in Cambridge. And I really encourage you to visit the transformative project at www.blackcantabs.org. Njoki wrote her PhD on the International Criminal Court intervention in Kenya, and she continues to research on the politics of peace and justice after intervention. So Njoki, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Sharath. It's a pleasure to be with my former supervisor again. And also I would want to thank the Gates Scholarship, and especially now when the Gates family has lost Bill Gates Sr., who passed on a few days ago. I just want to thank him, even as he's gone, and the family, and because really we would not be where we are as former Gates Cambridge scholars were it not for Bill Gates Sr.'s work and commitment to providing scholarships for people around the world, including myself. So thank you for that. Thank you very much. So I would want to go back to the question that this webinar is focusing on. How do we secure peace, lasting peace after conflict, especially in Africa and beyond. And one of the things I would want us to think about is that first, conflict and the need for lasting peace is not just something we need in Africa, it's everywhere in the world. You know what's going on in the US on race relations, and many other places in the world. So many times when we ask this kind of question, other conflicts around the world get lost because we are so focused on conflict in Africa. But because this webinar, we are focusing on conflict in Africa, I would want to argue that one of the ways that I think we can secure peace in Africa, in addition to dealing with the many root causes of conflicts, which I think we have all heard about, whether it's, you know, natural resources governance and general governance of a country. We also, at an international level, because most of securing peace is still done at the multinational level, whether it's through the UN or through the European Union or many other international organizations and also intergovernmental organizations. But in my research, which I, as mentioned, I focused also on how international intervention shapes peace and justice and peace building. I would argue that we can secure peace by decentering dominant ideas of peace, justice, and peace building. And if we look at how peace building has previously been done, whether in Africa especially, it's largely based on dominant ideas from the West. So by using one of scholar called Dipesh Chakrabarti, who talks about provincializing Europe, by provincializing European ideas or Western ideas of peace, of justice, we may find local ideas of peacemaking, local ideas of peace building that portend more lasting solutions for peace and for peace building. So many times when we do peace building work, so through the UNDP, for instance, if we look at one of the biggest peace building missions in Africa is DRC, and the most expensive. But to date, we are still yet to secure peace. And the question comes, how come we have not been able to secure peace despite one of the most expensive and one of the longest missions on peace building in Africa? And I argue that perhaps it's time, I'm not saying that the UN or all these international intervention kind of organizations depart, but it's time to work with the locals. It's time to work with local organizations so that we secure peace based on local realities. And I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Njoki. I mean, we can pick up on some of those important preliminary points soon in the discussion, and especially around what kinds of other worldviews and ideas emerge when you descend to the dominant ones. And I know that you've got some interesting empirical reflections on what justice means at a local level from the Kenyan context, and we can come to that in due course. One of the things you did mention, of course, is UN interventions, and to the extent that they seem to have very long-standing and lasting presence, the DRC, Darfur, just to mention a couple, but also the African Union increasingly, so regional interventions. And that's something that our next speaker, Dr. Mateja Peter, focuses her work on. So I'll turn to introducing Mateja to you all. Now, she's also, of course, a Gates alumnus, and we welcome her on that ground. She's a lecturer in international relations at the University of St. Andrews, where she also co-directs the Center for Global Law and Governance. She previously worked as a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, or NUPI. And Mateja obtained her PhD from the University of Cambridge, politics and actually in international studies, I suspect back then, in the day, as a Gates scholar, and subsequently held postdoctoral positions at research institutes in Washington, in Berlin, and Oslo. She works at the intersection of international relations and law, researching on global governance and international organizations, and peace operations and peace building. Previously, she led a major research project providing research support to the UN high-level independent panel on peace operations. And she has extensive field experience as well, having recently done work in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo and Darfur. Mateja is the editor of the United Nations Peace Operations in a Changing Global Order volume, which came out from Palgrave last year, and is currently finalizing a book on international authority in state building. So over to you, Mateja. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharath, and thank you to Cambridge Alumni for the invitation. And same as Njoki, I will say thank you to the Gates Cambridge for what was definitely one of the highlights of my lifetime, the experience of being able to be part of this community. And I will say a brief hello to my Gates family, because that's what I call my closest friends that have emerged through this scholarship. It really is a transformative experience, and I cannot thank the Gates family enough for supporting us. So I think my sort of intervention builds very nicely from where Njoki left us, and sort of thinking about how can we secure a lasting peace after conflict. And I think if we switch to the first slide, I wanted to sort of start with an understanding of where Njoki has already said that we know things work, right? So we actually have a pretty good understanding from decades of both policy studies and academic research, serious academic research, that more inclusive approaches, bottom-up approaches, dealing with root causes, addressing developmental issues, not just sort of immediate state issues and security issues, is actually what works, right? And that quite often international institutions, when they are dealing with particular countries or regions that require sort of these kind of initiatives, have shorter timelines, primarily because of the bureaucratic structures and funding initiatives. And so there's that lack of sort of longer term planning. So I wanted to put up a bit of a sort of academic lingo that we usually use in this context, but it's a very commonsensical lingo on kind of the spectrum of responses, that third-party responses, so international responses that have existed throughout sort of since basically the founding of United Nations, or sort of the more concerted international, not just national initiative to peace building. Sort of during the Cold War era, and this is kind of the most conservative or limited response to that comes from international community, we are primarily dealing with conflict management. So these are extremely limited, state-centric responses, primarily targeting local elites, looking at sort of potentially securing peace agreements and things like that, but there's very little intervention into internal affairs. So the idea with this is the goal isn't to actually resolve the underlying conflicts, to sort of build a lasting peace. The idea is mostly to prevent escalation of conflict beyond the borders, spill over into sort of more regional conflicts. I sometimes also like to say that this is basically conflict containment, right? So it's not just conflict management, but in some way, from an external perspective, it's a conflict containment. So on the opposite side, we will basically have conflict resolution, which is what most of sort of non-state actors have been emphasizing for as long as we have been sort of dealing with these conflicts, which are very much sort of structural responses to conflicts, dealing with root causes, dealing with communities, addressing issues of underdevelopment, working on domestic empowerment, and so on and so forth. But the primary local here is not the state, right? So it's not the state elites, but it's actually civil actors. So for practical purposes, while often misguided in some of their directives, a lot of external NGOs have this conflict resolution ambition. And so an interesting thing that happened after the end of the Cold War, and this is where we're kind of now starting to rethink some of the contemporary responses, is that we get a merger of conflict management and conflict resolution, trying to sort of look at it at conflict transformation, where essentially some of the conflict management strategies for dealing with local elites, but at the same time making sure that these elites are accountable, end up having a very big role in international responses. So this is something that to scholars will be known as liberal peace building. It could also be called state building, institution building. But the idea with all these responses is that state institutions end up being accountable to sort of domestic local actors. However, because the institutions implementing these conflict transformations tend to be United Nations, European Union, African Union, it's still a pretty state-centric approach. And because a lot of the funding is coming from the Western governments, the solutions are then sort of blueprints imposed from above, right? And there's kind of blueprints from one country to another country without much thinking how to contextualize it. As a response to that, and this is basically where scholarship is right now directing us, we have this critical conflict transformation, which is basically the conflict resolution aspect amplified in it. So the idea is exactly as Njoki was saying, to work much more on bottom-up solutions for local communities to actually be the primary drivers in terms of how we are implementing, how as external actors are implementing these solutions. And we know from research that these kind of initiatives actually reduce the chances of conflict. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to highlight, and I think this would be my big intervention in this discussion, is that institutional responses in the last decade have been essentially doing two things. One is there has been a major focus on Africa, and I have two slides for you to show. One is kind of looking at how the United Nations, so that's the next slide, where the UN interventions have been. Most of the UN peacekeeping operations are deployed in Africa, right? So we can discuss the reasons for that, but it's essentially, it's much easier to get a geopolitical consensus to do something in Africa than in other countries. So the little ones that are outside of African context are very small peacekeeping operations comparably to what is going on in Africa. And then the other one that I wanted to point out is the European Union, which is also, so that is on the next slide, which you can also see that most of the operations are actually again happening in Africa. So Africa has been a big focus in terms of the third-party interventions for partly selfish reasons as well, right? So partly it is geopolitical reasons that it's easier to get a consensus. But then the second thing that is happening, and this is on the next slide, is that in addition to focusing on Africa, we have actually seen that institutional responses in the last decade have moved away, not even from that critical conflict transformation that I was saying before, it's kind of best practice, but in a lot of ways, we're not even doing conflict transformation anymore. And in some ways, we are actually returning to the conflict management era. We've seen this in a lot of recent interventions in Congo, in South Sudan, in Mali, where the idea is actually to empower states, right, local elites, extend state authority, and quite often these states are not exactly the most accountable to people. There's a big focus on sort of stabilization strategy instead of longer term solutions and heavily militarized approaches. So I will end my sort of initial intervention just on saying that the worrying trend over the last 10 years is that despite the fact that we know over the last sort of decades of research on what actually are the best ways of addressing conflicts and sort of helping communities in supporting them in their own solutions, the reality is that most international interventions right now are moving in the opposite direction, which is a worrying trend for lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mateja. That was really, really interesting. I just want to encourage everyone in the audience to utilize the question and answer facility. Try to address your questions, if you can, to specific speakers. But I think there's an interesting debate and discussion coming up. I mean, we get a sense that actually some of the impositions of sort of democratic liberal ideas after the Cold War are part of the problem of displacing and dominating the spaces for discussion for a future politics after conflict. And yet at the same time, if while we're busy critiquing and being concerned with that liberal interventionism, it's in retreat anyway, because something more hard and fast compared to that is in place, which is a more self-interested conflict management logic operating. So interesting times that we very much are in. On this, what role do we have for international law, and how does it play a role in addressing some of the challenging experiences that exist of communities who live between international borders, as Harum, our next speaker, will put it. We'll come to that now. So Mateja, thank you, and looking forward to the discussion. So I want to introduce our final speaker, Harum Mukhayer. Now, she is a current Gates scholar and in her final year of her PhD in international law. She's studying at Pembroke College. Harum, welcome again. Now, you're researching communities between international borders, and I just love that formulation. I think it's a really interesting way of capturing something that is at the focus of your research that many of us wouldn't necessarily, grasp on first hearing it. You're a self-identified global nomad who traces her ancestral descent from Sudan, which is very dear to me, but was born in the Emirates and grew up in Scotland. Talk about climate change. During her time in Cambridge as a Gates scholar and member of Pembroke College, Harum is committed to inclusivity and diversity work, primarily motivated by making the Faculty of Law a safer and more welcoming place for BAME students. Prior to Cambridge, Harum worked for 8 years with the UN in Sudan, in South Sudan, and in Somalia. So she has a very good perspective on the UN system and UN institutions. For more information about her and about her research, you can actually go to her website, which is also on the website for this panel at hmukhayer.com. So I encourage you to do that. Over to you, Harum. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sharath. I'd like to echo what Njoki and Mateja have said, and I owe both gratitude and condolence to the Gates family. Following that, I'd like to kind of issue a disclaimer. So while I am African and the majority of my work has been in the African continent, I am not an Africa specialist. I am an international lawyer. And the bulk of my experience has been in international environment and natural resource law. And kind of through that experience, I've shifted focus to working on conflict and post-conflict, and specifically border dispute contexts. And from that emerged the realization through my kind of practice and my LM, I found this gap in how international law kind of applies obligations on states. And in doing so, I noticed that a lot of the communities in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Somalia are transboundary or pastoralists who rely on crossing an international border. And through that, I kind of directed my curiosity towards international border areas and the obligations that attach to them. And then found this glaring gap in how the rights of communities are completely absent from protection. So states have an obligation that starts and ends at its boundaries and leaves completely unaddressed the rights of communities and peoples between borders. And while this resonates very much within an African continent, where borders are very much arbitrary, Africa isn't necessarily kind of, an exception to that. So arbitrary borders are a feature of any international border. And so it's not necessarily a specialized glitch in the African matrix as such. And so in my talk today, I'll kind of focus with this kind of international view of borders, of conflict, and then I'll focus a bit more on kind of my reflections from working in Sudan and South Sudan, Somalia. So in the next slide, you'll see a map of the world's disputed territories. And this kind of shows you a wide spread of where disputed territories kind of are scattered across the globe. And if we look into the next slide, I can show you the areas where I've specifically focused on. And if we click to the next slide, we can see that there are areas, whether it's the US-Canada border, Honduras, El Salvador, US-Mexico border, the Irish border, Kurdistan, Kashmir, Sudan, so many borders where the rights of communities are disrupted. And so if we go on to the next slide, we can see that the fact that borders are disputed, there are conflict, it's not necessarily this kind of very niche African experience, but is a universal reality of borders. And so kind of bringing the focus back to specifically kind of the African continent and peace building, here are just some kind of highlighted good regional practices. I think Njoki and Mateja have kind of touched on these and kind of spoke generally about kind of the state-to-state aspects of how do you dissolve or just pause a conflict in order to arrive at a comprehensive peace settlement or an agreement. And so these kind of extensive negotiations between states and their governments, between rebel groups and various militias, are an important part of that regional practice to have a conversation going. The other aspect is arriving at a comprehensive peace agreement. And while the literature on comprehensive peace agreements is quite extensive, my position is that, I mean, it's great, have a comprehensive peace agreement, why not? And bring people together and arrive at a true, authentic settlement. And to the extent that is relevant or real, is obviously subject to the very specific conditions in a peace agreement and the context under which these conditions are fulfilled. Again, with Sudan, South Sudan specifically in mind, the element of international oversight has obviously been quite significant, specifically post-independence of South Sudan and in kind of protecting the border area. The African Union has played a significant role in kind of managing the border relations between Sudan and South Sudan. And so while this good regional practice kind of points to some necessary aspects, these are not sufficient, and probably for the same criticisms Mateja and Njoki kind of set out at the onset. So these are very kind of state-to-state focused. They kind of miss the reality of the lived experience of people. And as my thesis suggests, they completely miss the mark in terms of the rights of communities between borders who might flee in the incidents of conflict, who create this spillover effect, who might kind of escape a hostile environment and seek refuge overseas. And so while these good regional practices are necessary, they are not sufficient. Moving on to the next slide. Specifically, I'm kind of focusing on what happens in the first decade of peace building. And so assuming that there is a kind of peace settlement, a cessation of conflict, whether a kind of ceasefire agreement is fixed or is pending, kind of what Mateja referred to as, I think, conflict containment. So containing the conflict during the first decade of peace building should obviously be the priority. And it shouldn't just be the priority at the site of the conflict, but also the areas that might exacerbate or have a negative effect or be negatively affected by conflict. The second point is removing or reversing conflict drivers. And within what I have specifically in mind kind of draws on my environment and natural resource experience. And looking at communities where conflict, violent civil conflict is at issue, there's also the element of conflict drivers such as land degradation, land grabs, property rights, and all these things that kind of surround a conflict context, as well as like local economic development and things that affect the lived experience of people during conflict. The third point kind of echoes very much what Njoki was saying about like this ground, this bottom-up approach of looking at local communities. But I think specifically, the part of local communities that should be the focus of attention is more local government, of how do you then administer limited resources with a view to building limited capacity to resolve and kind of prevent future conflict from escalating. And this is essential, especially in contexts where the conflict itself might have an environment or natural resource component, and where people's livelihoods are intimately connected to natural resources. And the final point is the spillover effects across national borders. I feel kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place being an international lawyer and this view of the state as a sovereign, but at the same time recognizing that the state boundaries kind of are kind of fluid areas of a lived experience. And so recognizing that, sure, yes, states are sovereign, they have territorial integrity that shouldn't be compromised, but they still have an obligation to ensure that this movement is not compromised, but at the same time, kind of working in collaboration with other states. This is very much the topic of my PhD. And I refer to Kurdistan and Kashmir, the Irish border. I refer to lots of different cases, so I can talk about this a lot more if there are questions later on. But just to kind of conclude, I think, again, international borders, border conflicts are a feature of the world we live in, a world of arbitrary borders and kind of self-interested states. But at the same time, within the African continent, there's a wealth of kind of experiential evidence where states are at their face, at the state level, they're kind of bumping heads, but at the same time kind of creating concrete efforts. And in mine specifically, it's the UN Joint Program on Local Government in Somalia that I worked with for 4 years, where the focus was on local government, on building up capacity and sustaining it. So moving on to the next slide, which is my concluding slide, I would like to thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please do kind of use the Q&A facility. I think that's all from me. Back to you, Sharath.
Thank you, Harum, and I want to encourage you to follow that request for sending your questions. Send them through, and we can have a great discussion in the time that we have left. We have a good amount of time, and so I want to take this moment now to welcome back all of our panelists, and so Njoki and Mateja. Very glad to see Njoki still with us, because there was a heavy downpour in Nairobi where she is. The internet went out an hour ago, so she's on her phone, but so far so good. You're with us, which is fantastic. We've had a good few questions coming in already, and I can see many more coming in, which is fantastic. I want to start by just provoking all of you to take on this question as you wish. And that is that, you know, a lot of scholars of my generation as such have spent a good amount of their time, you know, critiquing the international for the way that it intervened and dominated the ideas around peace, around what future politics needs to look like, on how conflict resolution needs to occur. And all of you in some way or another have been speaking, you know, to challenge that and to remind us of the fact that there are better alternatives that have been well researched, and also lived experiences that challenge that and are very important to be brought back into focus. But we've also heard that we're in a period in which some of those liberal ideals and interventions are also in retreat. And I wonder, to what extent are we facing something more troubling, and is it the better the devil we once knew, which is that these interventions that were around human rights and democracy, for all of their paternalism, represented some kind of ideal compared to a retreat into self-interest, conflict management, worrying about borders and migration, etc. So that's a big, broad question. I'm going to ask you in turn to think to address that. So Njoki, first over to you. Oh, you're on mute, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Sorry about that. I hope you can hear me now. I think that's a very, very good question. How, and I think somebody else had asked in the chat. So without liberal peace or liberal interventionism, what else? I like to use the example of Somaliland, because in Somaliland, of course, it's not the best example, but it's a case study where in Somaliland there was little or no liberal interventionism. And if you look at Somalia with all the regional, the three regional kind of regions, Somaliland, Jubaland, and South, it still remains the most stable compared to the three, especially compared to Somalia with so much intervention from everywhere. And despite that, whether it's, so there's still lots of conflicts, both internal and from Al-Shabaab. So you can see, yes, it may not be, letting local kind of peace build by itself may not be the ideal. We may not have the time also to wait for that time, because I think it also requires a long, long time. Somaliland, also the dynamics probably were different. The Council of Elders is a small region, but it also maybe provides a bit of promise or a few lessons we can learn. If maybe we can let regions build peace, at a more decentralized level, and then later on we can deal with at the national level. But most of the time, I think we are dealing from the top, even when we are doing more locally. Even when we are talking local, we are talking about the local national, which won't work because people are still just as fragmented. But maybe if we went to a more decentralized level, it might work. But I still support for human rights. But again, it should not be something that is driven by, say, the UNDP office in that country or in that region. Let's go to the bottom and ask people, what does human rights mean to you? And as much as it's universal, let's not also assume that it's that universal. Maybe their priorities, yes, human rights are all universal, but they may have different priorities in different regions. And I think that's the work that we should be supporting.
Thanks, Njoki. There's a sense of a certain amount of disintervention that would be required to achieve or to realize that ideal. But Mateja, you spoke to something a little bit different. So, I mean, continuing on my question, but there was a sense that there is a body of research that supports an alternative that's not in that very dominant liberal state building mindset. It looks at more ideas from below. And yet, as Mark Russell in the question and answers, one of our audience members has asked, if there are such points to better solutions, where is that gone and why? And I want to attach that to a question from Alison Bell in the Q&A, who says, well, look, what is driving this retreat into conflict management? Is it the affected states themselves, or is it actually these international actors? So perhaps if you could help us with those.
I mean, I really loved your opening prompt, right? Sort of saying that, we loved to critique liberal peace building, yet now we're kind of hoping that returns. Because it might be the lesser of the two devils that we're living. And I think for those of us that remember the 90s, right, it was not a great time, and there was a lot of mistakes being made in terms of how we were doing. But I think for most of us, there was this period of hope, right? So there was still ways of fixing things, of how we were doing it. And while I am not, in no way a big proponent of liberal peace building, there are sort of policies in there that worked. There were sort of modifications, but I think the reality is, and I think some of the questions are going into it, it's just the world has gotten a lot more complex over the last sort of 20, 30 years. And in fact, some of the responses, I would say, from the international community, and here I'm talking about sort of international organizations, right? Sort of the big sort of players or states in the field are very state-centric, right? States know how to deal with states. States have state-centric approaches. And I like sort of how we're getting to it, that in a lot of these contexts, sort of more regional approaches would make much more sense, whether those are regions that are smaller than states or bigger than states. Yet states know how to deal with states, right? And the reality is that in contemporary conflicts, one of the reasons why we are experiencing a lot of the issues, right, where even the sort of the violent non-state actors that are making situation much worse on the ground than we have seen sort of even 20 years ago, right, in terms of the groups that in the West we would describe as terrorists, right? So there's that agenda of we need to deal with sort of terrorists who potentially have an ability to come to our countries, therefore the external security sector. But the local governments are also interested in dealing with these actors because they are undermining their authority. And in some cases, and believe me, I have no love for groups such as Al-Shabaab or M23, but they are representing particular constituencies at the local level. And so it is actually often quite difficult to disentangle this sort of where the local drivers are and where the international drivers of the conflicts are, because the states themselves are interested in dealing with these actors, and the international community, as in international states, are also, right? And which then often forgets sort of the people and their needs that are caught in kind of between the two sides.
Yeah, so we're sort of stuck with both the state as an inevitable actor in these contexts, and states acting, seeing like states, as James Scott would say, but in a slightly different manner. Harum, you helped us think about, well, states aren't just states at the big sovereign national level. There's also the kinds of building of institutions that are much more local. And you mentioned sort of local governance and the program you were involved with in Somalia. One of the questions that has come through is from Florentine, who asks, well, that may be well and good, but doesn't politics go all the way down? Isn't there sort of stuff that is really messy and difficult to deal with in terms of local political elites and dominant actors? And that's even more the case or more troubling when you have a weak sort of central state as well. So I guess answering that, but then also this other, this question of what alternatives there are to a sort of a liberal worldview on institutions. The floor is open to you.
I think it's an interesting conversation. I think I'm kind of tempted to put on my law thinking hat and address it from the fact that the fact is we have states. For better or worse, they are the system we've inherited, and for the most part, it's a system that works at some level. But I think I'm kind of worried about the level of generalization about what the state is, because the state is essentially, if we're looking at Westminster's style government, or kind of, it's made up of different levels, right? The state itself is kind of the sum of its parts. And whether the government is represented by a head of state and within the executive and the specialized kind of ministries and so on. And I think, sure, politics plays a role in that, but I think when we're talking about local government, we're looking at kind of that devolved or decentralized system. And sure, that might be open to corruption in a conflict setting as much as it is potentially in the White House. So in that sense, no government is immune from corruption or from, problematic decisions or politics. And so I'm going to set the politics aside because others can probably speak on that better than I can. And just kind of clarify that I think, local government, specifically looking at where the conflict is geographically, the administration, the administrative law underpinning how local governments are administered, how resources flow into them, how they kind of coordinate kind of district councils and community natural resource management plans, and kind of the nuts and bolts of what makes a government within the vast territorial sovereignty of the state. So I think for me, that's kind of what breaks it down.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I get a very strong sense of the need for individuals to be able to take action to create create their government, to constitute themselves as a political community. I mean, going back to sort of American Republic thought at the time of independence, is the act of constituting a government is the first act of the people, right? So do we miss that when we come with these technocratic blueprints and best practices from above? And yet, Mateja, we've had a few questions that are trying to resurrect and find the positive agenda, like talking about, I think Sami mentioning, Hawkins mentioning positive peace and that agenda. Thomas Nordberg talking about, well, what about conflict prevention? Where does that feature? And then speaking a little bit beyond your remit, I guess more to Harum and Njoki, but around reconciliation, transitional justice, and building that in right from the outset in these sorts of interventional processes. And I guess the question there is, do you feel that we should still be recovering those agendas? We still should be working out how to deliver those agendas through the institutions we have. And if so, as one anonymous attendee asked, is the AU, for example, just a much better way to locate the politics of that kind of agenda in the African context, obviously?
I think we live in fascinating times. And so the project that I'm currently working on, and this is something that a lot of people are starting to think through, is because the interesting aspect is, if you actually look at what international institutions are stressing, right? So if you look at sort of the UN Secretary General, for example, or the African Union communique just yesterday came out on peace building, the Peace and Security Council, or the European agenda. There's a lot of discussion about sort of prevention, about sort of conflict resolution behind these things. And I do think, I'm going to say, us as academics, other people as citizens, right? This is the agenda that we should be supporting because we actually know that it works, right? So the reality is that at the moment, there is a bit of a disconnect between sort of, for example, what the UN Secretariat, right, knows that the best solutions are, and then what the Security Council ends up mandating, especially in a lot of the most acute cases, right? Or the fact that whenever we have sort of conflict prevention initiatives, we have these grand resolutions coming out, but then when countries have to put up money, we always run out of it, right? So it's an interesting discussion, this, because I think states actually know perfectly well, right? So states as abstract, or governments know perfectly well what would work best for the community in question. But then at some point, the interests that governments might have about protection of their own citizens might actually come into play. And the reality is that, you know, I hate to say that, I like being optimistic, and I do think that there is an agenda that can actually live, right? And that's why I will say I'm personally a big supporter of both African Union, United Nations in terms of what the goals are. But the reality is that at the moment, I think a lot of the big states are actually undermining the agenda that I think they know perfectly well would actually be better. So the more, you know, energy we can throw behind this, I'm not a prime minister or anything like that, right? But the more energy we can do and pressure we can put on people to support these agendas that we know that works, I think that's one way to resurrect it. And at the same time, if I can just add one thing, I do think that the fact that a lot of our, I'm going to say current, but even more importantly, future problems are linked to transboundary issues. So the way that Harum was saying, right, they might be connected to environmental issues, refugees, right, and things like that, will, in some way, states might be retrieving to more nationalistic policies, but at the same time, in the long run, I think there will come a realization that only international cooperation can actually work on this. So in the long run, I remain optimistic, but we might be there for a bumpy ride.
Mm-hmm. Well, the optimism, I think, is greatly valued by members of the audience. And yeah, it is one of the paradoxes of our times that the retreat to myopia and self-interest and nationalism seems to go lockstep with the emergence of our collective problems that need urgent collective solutions. I want us to spend a moment walking the talk a bit. So we have heard from Njoki about decentering these dominant ideas. We have heard about making sure that the perspectives, the local perspectives, the experiences, the agency is brought much more into focus. I want to ask Njoki to come in here at this point, if you can, Njoki, to give us some more testimonial as such of what you found peace and justice, these big terms, meant in the everyday lives of war-affected or violence-affected communities in Kenya, just to sort of remind us that we can talk about the local as much as we want, but we need to listen to it. And if you can just bring that to life a bit, that would be great.
Thank you, Sharath. Yes, my research continues and was still on this. Not really, I didn't set out to decenter those dominant ideas, but I found one of the reasons that the ICC failed, for lack of a better word, so some would say it faced such challenges or it failed in Kenya, is largely because of these dominant ideas of justice that the ICC brought and precluded other alternative ideas it found at the local level. And so, like for instance, what was justice for many people who suffered violence in Kenya in 2007, that the ICC would tell, we are going to charge the masterminds of this. But for those people, the victims that the ICC purported to support, many of them did not see the value of prosecuting the people that the ICC chose to prosecute at the International Criminal Court. For them, justice was more at the everyday level. Justice was about economic everyday sustenance. How can they get out of the poverty trap that they are in? Justice was about prosecuting those people who attacked them locally, their neighbors, people they could see at the everyday level. So justice for many victims of violence, it's very direct, it's very urgent, it's very everyday. But at the international level, justice continues to be this idea of justice that is very distant. It's still about Nuremberg, and yet many of these communities have moved from that idea of Nuremberg, getting this big person who masterminded, justice. And when we come to many African settings, that big man who masterminded violence is connected to them in many ways, in terms of, say, for instance, reciprocal, they're in a kind of a moral economy where that person becomes a very important person, not just for them, but for the entire, for instance, ethnic group, to advance their interests. So they are not likely to be the person sacrificing this person for their local or for their everyday justice. So if the ICC, for instance, in Kenya, had come and talked to people at the local level and maybe prioritized other forms of justice. So maybe it's also, I'm not against international justice as is, the liberal justice. It's just the way it needs to be more nuanced, probably thinking around these local ideas of justice, prioritizing them. And then with time, there would have been that opportunity to take out these masterminds of violence. But instead, they acted using a Nuremberg idea, and of course the case fell flat. So it's time to start thinking about local justice. What does it mean? What does it mean for these people to feel secure, ideas of security? What is peace for people at the local level? So that we can prioritize their needs, and even when we need to deal with those other issues, the time will come. So I think it's also prioritizing what matters to these people as per now, not what matters to the court. Because I think the ICC wanted to also, it's about the image. The court still wants to be taken seriously. But then those ideas start conflicting with the needs of the people who want justice, but not what exactly the court is thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Njoki. So we've had a few questions. One that's anonymous for Harum, which is on colonialism and whether colonialism is responsible for the kind of conflict areas you see, the border disputes. And I want to link that to this idea of, also decolonizing, in effect, peace to some extent, which is, I know it's a big leap, but like, do we need to think about our border communities and the people who live in these border areas, in these liminal spaces, that do they have an insight into other ways in which we need to think about peace because of their experience? Is that a way, an entry point, linking to some of the things that Njoki has said, of trying to find another language, another vocabulary, another set of imaginaries and ideas of what can and should be done? And it's sort of the pincer movement to Mateja's point, which is we still need these big institutions, we need the resourcing, we need the efforts, but we need to find ways to not let them dominate the agenda. So I'm trying to sort of bring it all together in this. You need to do it for us.
Very nicely done. Yeah, I think in a way, kind of transboundary self-determination, as I expressed it in my thesis, is very much kind of connecting people to territory, whereby they have ties, cultural, religious, livelihood, or family ties that require the crossing of an international border. And I kind of demonstrate that this doesn't have to be necessarily a continuous land border. It could be islands that are separated. So if you think of like the Chagosians and the Chagos Islands, that separation. And the question on colonization is, so boundary making is not just necessarily an outcome of colonization. It's a feature of just statehood, empire building, and so on. And in my thesis, I kind of draw on the Treaty of Versailles and kind of that redistribution of territories that followed from the treaty. And so is it just decolonization? Is it colonization alone? That's not necessarily. But that doesn't mean there's no need to decolonize. And I think decolonizing the mind and the international lawyers' approach to viewing statehood, state territory, and people within the borders of a state and across it is really what kind of requires that kind of decolonization.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. We're sort of quickly running out of time. Njoki needs to go and teach a class, which is fantastic. There was one question about the crucial role women play in conflict resolution and peace building. I've decided that this panel speaks as an answer to that, and I mean that sincerely. That actually, one of the things that happens when you decenter is you should admit a plurality of ideas and a different set of lenses. And I think that's what we've really had today. We've had some great questions coming in from many of you. So thank you for all of those. As we said, this has been recorded and it will be on the Dear Cambridge, Dear World, Yours Cambridge YouTube channel. But I really want to thank all of our speakers. I think it's been really deep and enriching. Sometimes panels don't get real ideas on the table, and I think we did today. So thank you to each of you. And I think the agenda is large, but it's as important as it ever was. But somehow in sort of unsettled times, it's also times of possibility and times of new voices, of new creativity. So hopefully this is a time when we can bring a lot of that to bear. So wishing you all well, and thank you very much.